So good morning. My name is Mark Schneider. I'm a white-collar partner at Kirkland & Ellis, and I want to echo the thanks to Dice Day and Session University and the Japanese Embassy in particular for sponsoring today's conference. We've had the privilege of participating now for all 5 years of it, and in the decade or so I spent at DOJ, one of kind of the privileged times was to spend a year at a U.S. embassy overseas, and so I appreciate very much the importance of having justice ministry prosecutors, at embassies overseas and the role that embassies play in facilitating law enforcement cooperation. And so it's really wonderful that the embassy would host this conversation as it has for a number of years now. The topic of our panel this morning is compliance, which I think is a very appropriate second panel following the discussion that we had this morning, given Glenn's comment that if you had to pick one of the three through points of the DOJ policy, the most important one would be compliance. And we've had a little bit of a change to our lineup for this morning in that Sam Buell wasn't able to join us. Eugene Soltis is joining us remotely. Thank you very much, but I think we'll still be able to have a very robust discussion with those we have here. Compliance is an interesting topic in that I think a lot of it has been sort of stagnant for a long time, and yet we really are, due to some of the panelists today, in a period of, I think, real innovation in terms of the development of compliance programs, both from the perspective of what's important for DOJ, what the scholarly work of Veronica and Eugene have contributed to this area, as well as others, as well as sort of the work that's being done in the private sector through data analytics. So it really is, I think, kind of a springtime of development within kind of the compliance world at large. So to start the conversation, I thought, why don't I invite our four panelists to just briefly introduce themselves, and then we can start with some questions. And Veronica, would you perhaps like to start?
Hi, my name is Veronica Martinez. I really appreciate the invitation to be here. It's so wonderful to have these conversations. I'm a professor at Duke University Law School, and I research organizational and professional ethics, and I have a particular interest in compliance, monitorships, and things of that nature.
Hi, nice to be here, and again, thank the organizers for the invite. My name is Mark Grunwig. I am an assistant chief of one of the criminal sections of the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice. I've been a prosecutor with the Antitrust Division now for about 26 years, so quite some time, and I've had the privilege and opportunity to work closely on several of my investigations and cases with the Japan Fair Trade Commission and the Tokyo Prosecutor's Office as we investigated some of those cases. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Hi, I'm Matt Galvin. I'm counsel compliance and data analytics at the fraud section. I actually started the same day as Glenn a year ago. And like Glenn, I was previously the chief compliance officer, but on technology and beer. I worked for AB InBev as their CCO for a number of years. It's absolutely a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Matt. And then Professor Soltis.
Good morning. I'm Eugene Soltis. I'm a professor at Harvard Business School, where all my work and research is focused on kind of compliance data, and particularly how we use different sorts of data to better understand where there might be gaps or strengths within the organization to measure effectiveness. And I'm also the founder of an outside organization called Integrity Lab that develops solutions primarily focused on compliance analytics to support organizations. Pleasure to be here today.
Terrific. So to start, maybe a good place to start is for the panelists to kind of offer their perspectives on, what is the definition of an effective compliance program? What does it mean for a compliance program to be effective? And perhaps, Jean, you could start with that, and then maybe we can hear then from the DOJ kind of perspective on their evaluation of compliance programs. So I was just going to suggest that maybe you could start, Jean, with elaborating kind of what is the definition of an effective compliance program. What does it mean for compliance program to be effective from your perspective, and then maybe after that we could hear from some of the DOJ perspectives on how they think about what is an effective compliance program.
Well, great. Well, I think we could probably spend the entire panel, I know, trying to wrangle this one. But I'll give my succinct, kind of intuitive, informal definition, which is based upon the impact. So when we think of effectiveness, it's not what's on paper, but it's actually how it actually impacts the organization, which means the people that are within it. And so when we think about the code of conduct, when we think about policies, when we think about training, it's not the existence of training, but whether that actually seeks to mitigate the associated desirable conduct. And I think where a lot of the opportunities and recent trends have been is to, with each part of a compliance program, whether it's the hotline or whether it's training, actually having organizations think about what is the goal, what is the KPI associated with that, rather than simply the existence of it. And I think this is where it kind of naturally leads to being more data-driven and out of trend, because to the extent you want to know, did we achieve something from it? Did it actually have any kind of impact on behavior? One needs to collect, not necessarily just quantitative, but also qualitative data to help support that it's actually achieving that in practice.
Great. And Matt, maybe you could talk about kind of the DOJ's perspective on the evaluation of compliance programs.
Sure. I mean, as Glenn went through great lengths, we're a prosecutorial body. We're not a regulatory body. But we do try to communicate and act transparently with our cases and with different things we put out. You know, one of the documents that the fraud section authors is the evaluation of corporate compliance guidelines, which tries to communicate what we ask and how we ask it. And I think the question in that is, you know, we're trying to get at is a compliance program well designed and effective. And so when you look at the different cases, you look at the questions we ask, I think often it kind of falls into 5 broad categories. What is effective about a compliance program? There's no singular metric that says a company's compliant or not. But there's roughly 5 areas. You know, one is the kind of risk and opportunities within a corporate organization. You know, what do they do? What is its business model? What is its history? And then where is its touch points for, you know, if it's anti-corruption, where is it interfacing with the government? If it's, you know, market facing, how is it interfacing with markets, and how does it, you know, how transparently does it trade and work with other, you know, members of a market? Another would be culture and incentives. And we talked in the last section, you heard a lot about clawbacks and incentives. You know, how are people motivated? You know, one definition of culture is the worst conduct within an organization the leadership is willing to tolerate. And so consequence management in that aspect of compliance, and how is that functioning? Are you identifying misconduct, and how are you treating it? And as Eugene said, there's different metrics you can see. Often you'll see a pattern, you know, where a company has no compliance program, they have no problems. And then they have one big, gigantic, huge crisis of a problem. And then they start to look, and you start to see others. And then as people become more aware and compliance programs mature, it's not that problems go away, but the kind of spread and magnitude of the problems. You have kind of a wider spread, a lower magnitude across an organization. These are indicative of more compliance programs. And you can look at the control environment. I mean, that is probably one of the more, you know, well-documented and kind of intersection with other disciplines and functions. You know, I think Matt is an accountant from the last panel. We could talk at length about how you measure control and COSO frameworks and guidance. But generally you look at that. And are you, whether it's human resources or money, oftentimes a lot of the controls around a corporation have to do with, how money is disposed within a corporation. And are there controls around that? Or is it a corporation that, a singular person can say, that should happen, and it happens, as opposed to independent checks and kind of first, second, third line reviews. I think another key area is transparency. We talked a lot about kind of voluntary disclosure and how, helpline might work. A lot of that is trying to get at how transparent, operations are throughout a company. Is the company siloed? That's a big question in the WCCP, the fraud section guidance. And that's kind of going towards, do different parts of the organization know what each other is doing? The idea being that the more transparent people are operating, the it's a fairly large disincentive to committing wrongdoing if a lot of people can see what you're doing and there's a clear either continuous monitoring or effective audit function to get there. And the last is the compliance kind of framework itself. How empowered and often independent is compliance with an organization? Again, you can look at different metrics of who does the compliance officer report to? Are they free to act? What sort of kind of powers are imbued to the compliance officer? But those kind of five, when you piece together recent enforcement actions, when you piece together the speeches, when you piece together the ECCP, it kind of goes to the operational framework of those five things. And is the company trying to measure that and trying to see if it's trying to do the right thing? And that's kind of what, to me, an effective compliance program is. I don't know, antitrust.
Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, and I guess I would just maybe add, when I think about it, I kind of go to the bottom line. What's the purpose of this program ultimately? And in my mind, it is to detect and prevent illegal or unethical or wrongful conduct. And obviously the things that Matt talked about are the kind of the outward measures or the structure of the program that we can look at and think, is it getting to that bottom line? That's ultimately the question. And then, so I think for it truly to be effective, there has to be a way of measuring, are we actually detecting and are we actually preventing? And some of the structural components of that are the incentives in place to protect whistleblowers, or the structures in place to incentivize the rank and file employees to report wrongdoing when they see it or when they're involved in it? Are the managers and the supervisors being actually evaluated and judged, at least in some part, on that culture of compliance? And just by way of example, so in the antitrust realm, we have had, over the years, repeat players. And one example is I worked in an investigation involving marine hose companies. As part of that investigation, that company engaged in a fairly robust internal investigation. Yet that same company was in a few years later as part of our auto parts investigation because they were too narrowly focused in looking for a specific type of conduct instead of looking more broadly. And I think when you have an effective compliance program, you're not going to be so narrowly focused.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that point, Mark, in the context of kind of risk assessment, because I think that is really kind of a common theme where companies have, either sort of evolved over time to not kind of capture risks that they now face, or their compliance program is sort of informed by some bad event in one specific area. Things get focused on that, and then you miss sort of other areas. But before we do that, I wanted just to offer Veronica, as a scholar of kind of compliance program, ethical, organizational ethics, is your sense that sort of there's been sort of an evolution in terms of compliance programs, the role of kind of compliance with organizations, and sort of what that, has that evolved, the meaning of kind of a compliance program evolved over time?
So I think the answer to that is certainly yes. I think that different kind of folks who think about the history of what we think about compliance today might point to different time periods. I've tended to focus on 3 interventions in the 1990s. So one intervention would be, there's a few interventions from the 1990s. So you have the organizational sentencing guidelines are passed, which specifically say that you need to prevent and detect misconduct. If you read the guidelines carefully, they also say things about the importance of, it's not just about what does the law say, it's also about what's going on in your industry, and it also matters what your particular policies say. Another intervention in the 90s from the government would be the Holder Memorandum, which I think helped to spark a renewed interest in corporate misconduct and enforcement efforts within the United States. Another intervention in the 1990s is a case called Caremark. It's a case that comes out of the Delaware courts, which is kind of our most important corporate law courts within the U.S. And I think that there are some who really point to Caremark as a beginning metric of compliance within firms, in part because you get certain protections if you've used good faith efforts and you haven't as another case says, if you haven't utterly failed in engaging in certain activities. And then another intervention at that same time, as all of these things are happening, is actually some work of Jennifer Arlen's, which talked about the right incentives for creating the right incentives for firms to monitor their employees. So all of that's happening in the 90s. And now we're sitting here about 25 years later and need to assess whether the things that we've put in place make sense. And so I think we've certainly seen an evolution. We see a lot more enforcement activity. I think that some of my colleagues in business schools actually lament some of what we've been doing in the legal sector, in part because we've spent so much time focused on monitoring and really focused on like, how do I incentivize individual employees? How do I monitor them effectively? That one of the downsides to monitoring is that you strip individual autonomy, the individual's understanding of their autonomy and their responsibility over the over their part of the firm. And that's not something we talk a lot about, I think, in the legal spaces, but I do think that that's a critique. That is a critique I've heard from some of my colleagues in business schools, is that we aren't spending enough time on how do we reinforce the autonomy of the individual to do things like blow the whistle and to tell us what's going on in certain situations.
And Jean, being a professor at a business school, do you have kind of a reaction to that, to the final comment there?
I think we're still learning a lot of law. Let me put that caveat in a room full of I know attorneys. I'll say the perspective I will have, and I primarily teach in our leadership and executive education programs, is at the topic of compliance. I joke is one that I have to do a lot to make what I call sufficiently sexy to get people's attention. It's the last thing on people's mind until it becomes the most relevant, until a couple of the people on the panel are on the other side of the table and they're hiring defense counsel. And then all of a sudden it's very relevant and they want to learn a lot. But until that point, the notion of compliance is an activity, it's a cost center within the organization, and something that many organizations are seeking to both either minimize or I would say check the box. But I would say it's not because they don't care about it. I think they do care about it, but I don't think many organizational leaders think that misconduct is something that will apply to them in their organization until it does. No one actually thinks, and having spent time with a lot of prominent white collar offenders, no one thinks that they're at a firm that doesn't act with integrity or is going to engage in misconduct, short of someone being like the mob. People think they're in a great organization that, of course, is going to stay away from the DOJ until it does. So I think there's a lot of it's a psychological exercise on top of the legal constructs that we're discussing here, which is what makes it so interesting, fascinating, but also exceptionally challenging in a business context.
If I can jump in on a couple points there. One, to Veronica's point, of course a lot of managers don't like compliance because there's an aspect of compliance empowerment that's a democratization of authority within an organization. And if you have managers that have ultimate authority over their people, and compliance is saying, no, we have a centralized set of rules, and if you violate that, an independent authority is going to say, your star salesperson can't work here anymore. That creates a huge amount of friction. And there's always invariably a ton of pushback within organizations of that. And I think of the history of compliance, and maybe it's because I used to work in an alcohol organization, but one of the more fascinating early studies of compliance was actually the Lewis and Clark expedition in America, which was early 19th century. A small group of folks had to go to really challenging territory, and they had a group of soldiers. And how do you control the soldiers? How do you get them to keep going further and further wild? A lot of the way to control behavior was through whiskey. And they would ration out and create really a set of incentives, not dissimilar to what we're talking about now. If you behave in a certain way, you can have so many grams of whiskey on this. But guess what happened? People would start to steal the whiskey because you're out there and everyone's armed. And so they had to have a huge amount of set of rules. And suddenly, this incentive program for people to go forward had to have a huge amount of rules to control and protect the whiskey supply. And there was a huge amount of resources sent guarding the whiskey on the Lewis and Clark expedition which was there to kind of keep people moving forward. And suddenly you have all this overhead, and right, and it's, again, the parallel to modern compliance programs is quite, amazing to me, that you have this set of incentives that then people want to subvert for their own purposes, and you have this huge amount of carrying costs on the whiskey to incentivize people going forward, for lack of a better way to keep people moving ahead in an organization. So compliance programs have been with us for a very long time, and whether that was a good one or not, I think it's not a terrible mental model to think of, is your compliance program more sophisticated than Lewis and Clark's?
So that's a great story that I had not heard before. I'm interested in the cost point that you mentioned, Matt, and that I think Jean alluded to as well. I'd be interested to know from Jean or Veronica or others, we think of it as a cost center, compliance as a cost center, but investors are also looking for kind of risk, adjusted returns. And in the last panel, there was a robust discussion about perhaps the difference in the M&A context between sort of a public strategic company versus a private equity investor that would buy with the expectation of selling in a few years. And there's another way to look at that too, which is that private equity investors that are trying to kind of get returns across a portfolio, if you can take some of the risk out of the portfolio, presumably that's a good thing. Is there any work that's been done around sort of, assessing what kind of, rates of return accrue to kind of investments in the compliance function for business organizations, or is part of the challenge in sort of selling compliance investments the fact that this is sort of too, ill-defined to really kind of affect the capital allocation decisions?
So I'm going to back out to your original comment to thinking about the costs of compliance. And so I think compliance is a cost center, and so this is overhead, and they are people who are perceived as folks who are telling you no, and you're just getting in the way of my ability to make profits. And so there are a lot of concerns there. In the recent 3M settlement, the marketing department was sitting there hiding things from the compliance department so that they could do what they felt like they needed to do to make profit. So that's a concern. I do think, though, it's important for firms not to think of the cost of compliance in I think you should think of costs broadly, right? So you can think about, if I'm not compliant, I might end up with a settlement from the government. Frankly, you can budget for that at this point, to a certain extent. I might think about my cost of doing an investigation. If you're a sophisticated firm, you probably can budget for that too. And so there are certain things that you can fold in. And so I remember I was talking to the general counsel of an organization that had just finished a costly monitorship. So they had a costly internal investigation, a costly monitorship. They just spent millions of dollars on all sorts of things. And I said to him, I know this other Fortune 500 company is creating a team in-house to go do FCPA audits worldwide. And I said, the idea is to detect earlier, right? So it's going to be a 4-person team. So now you're paying for 4 people and their overhead and their benefits and whatever. So now you've added a cost center. But that organization thought it was worth it to hopefully not have a violation later. And I suggested this to the general counsel, and his response was, "Oh no, we'd never do that." And I'm sitting there thinking, you just finished this really costly investigation for a failure to detect. And chances are you're going to have another failure to detect, given the size of your firm. And so why is that cost center? So anyway, so I just think that you have to think about the cost in a really broad way. So I think if you think about compliance as a cost center that says no, in some ways that is short-sighted to the other sorts of things that might come down the road. I also think that there are costs that we aren't always thinking about, in the sense that sometimes we really focus on legal risk, but there's lots of other types of risk that compliance can help, like technical formal legal risk. There's lots of different types of risks that compliance can help you think about. When I started thinking about compliance several years ago, I was incorporating diversity risk within my thoughts of compliance, and people were basically pushing back on me when I would say that. And I don't get the same sort of pushback today, post Me Too, because now people realize that there are lots of different types of risks that can cause monetary harm as well as reputational harm to the firm. And so I think thinking about compliance broadly and risk broadly is really important. But as to your capital allocation, no, I can't answer your capital allocation question. Maybe Eugene.
James, did you?
Oh, I can say there are studies on that, but I will say they are predictably what I call superficial, kind of what you would expect of taking kind of voluntarily kind of self-disclosure aspects of a compliance program and saying, of course, those have better compliance, are higher performing. But those are, again, pretty superficial in part because I think the challenge here is how do firms signal effective compliance? Because right now, if we were to go, let's say, the Fortune 100 and go online as an investor, you would say their code of conduct kind of all looks similar. They're like 60, 80 page colored documents that kind of say the same things. They all have a hotline, again, run by about 3 or 4 firms that all kind of look the same. They all say they have a zero tolerance policy toward more or less any kind of misconduct. It all looks kind of the same, but I think everyone here appreciates there is wild variation across that set of firms. And so I really think, to your question, what is how can firms actually signal when they are doing more effortful work, when it's not just on the heels and following some type of crisis, that they're actually doing more, they're investing? I think where it does manifest, and we can actually see this in the data, is you can actually see it manifest in how employees see, behave, and are able to retain people. It's absolutely true if you actually look at survey data about people's perceptions of corporate leadership. If they don't think management talks the talk, if they routinely face pressures to violate policies, if they don't have psychological safety on the team, all things that we think of part of compliance culture, where does it manifest most immediately? It'll manifest in lower productivity, which actually has an impact on the firm's performance. It will impact in turnover. In the longer run, those firms will underperform. I think the more challenging parts is a lot of that data is typically collected, I will say, in more of a marketing fashion rather than an introspective fashion. And to the extent that firms know details, they know things about that, but the signaling value is very hard outside, I think, to outside entities. But I think there are a lot of opportunities for firms to potentially show more because there is variation.
Yeah, good. Go ahead.
No, if I can jump in, largely from my experience in the private sector, where I could do a lot of kind of anecdotal studies without the rigor, right, that the academics pursued. But it was very compelling when I was in the CCO chair to the board that from a talent management perspective, having a robust ethics program was very important to the workforce. And it kind of made intuitive sense that if you're trying to promote a meritocracy, having ethical fair play meant that the talent succeeds. And those that would cheat or bribe or find ways to get around wouldn't be the most talented, they were just most willing to do that to seize an objective. And those that were more talented or had more ability started to see losses, and that you started over time. If you're promoting ethics, you would attract and retain more people. And we did see a lot of correlation, and I did have kind of people study this, that there was a demographic influence too, that people below 35 were much more driven to see kind of promote ethical culture than older people, myself included, ironically. But there was other things that we saw as well. And I've seen both anecdotally and through a decent amount of data that a lot of, say, corruption schemes are both highly inflationary and very contagious. That if you're paying bribes, the number of bribes that you start to tolerate proliferate, and the size of them get higher, usually in very inefficient ways, because you're not kind of a lot of companies fall on this. They start to try and track where the bribes are going to manage efficiency and return of investment of bribes, and that creates kind of evidentiary problems in an investigation, or they don't, and then people just steal the money because no one's tracking where the bribes are going. And quite often, very little of the bribes are actually going to government officials. It's usually kind of siphoned off by a lot of people that just see kind of an open season. And we did other things in my former life as well. We had programs where we looked, and I remember, challenging sales teams that they needed kind of certain funds that they said without that we would absolutely sales would fall off a cliff. We needed to kind of keep up these sales practices. And over a month, we kind of stopped and kind of created clear kind of incentive structures that were much more visible and transparent.
And month 1, sales plummeted, but month 2, they returned and came back, but margins improved. So the weakness of the control environment was, again, kind of testing the theory that money wasn't going to where the salespeople said necessarily it was, but in fact we could achieve higher top line and bottom line with more compliant investment environments. And constantly, I mean, part of the CCO role is to constantly beg for money. And so we were always looking for different ways to create the proof points of that, and to show that compliance was a positive investment, and that we were getting strong return on investment for compliance programs. Now that's not always going to be the case. Kind of transitioning into government, there are clear areas where there is an incentive to lie and steal for big ticket items. And I think there has to be an appropriate set of deterrents to stop that from happening. But a lot of things in an organization, I do think there's a lot out there to show positive incentives and positive ROI on compliance programs.
And let me ask maybe Matt or Mark to comment on Gene's observation that if you look at the Fortune 100, all of their compliance policies, at least kind of on paper, look the same. So how does, just in a very practical brass tacks way, does DOJ evaluate, what do they review to assess kind of the adequacy of compliance programs? There's obviously kind of policies that outline kind of the 3 big questions, but in terms of actually trying to kind of distinguish what's real from what's not real, and in terms of what the department expects to see in kind of real terms from a company who's now subject to kind of an evaluation of its compliance program.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe just to clarify, I would say publicly look the same, because I obviously know internally they're not the same. So I'll just clarify.
Understood.
Yeah, and I would direct anyone that is interested in this to look at both the antitrust division within the Department of Justice in 2019, put out a pretty robust summary of what types of things that the antitrust division would be looking at. It's similar to, but has some differences from the criminal division, similar document that was just updated earlier this year. And that sets out, of course, kind of the top 3 overarching questions about how the program is structured and what it's accomplishing, but then it gets into 9 specific areas. But from the antitrust perspective, we're looking to see what compliance have they focused on that goes to the types of crimes we'd be prosecuting in the antitrust world. It's not uncommon for us, even today, to have a company before us talking about their compliance program, and maybe it's in the healthcare industry, but it's entirely focused on various regulations, involving drugs or other healthcare factors. But when we start talking to employees, they received almost no training on price fixing or bid rigging or antitrust issues that we're focused on. I've been shocked even in the government contracting space. You might have compliance on, overbilling and some of the other compliance matters that they're most focused on, but they haven't actually talked about market allocation or bid allocation. So we're certainly, from an antitrust perspective, we're going to focus on, are they actually engaged in compliance relating to antitrust enforcement, and how is that being manifest? Or is it just kind of a broad check-the-box overarching compliance program that is not really getting at specific, and this goes to some of the risk assessment, what is the business we're engaged in, and what are the types of most likely violations that we may run into? It needs to be focused on that, just kind of as a starting point.
No, I remember, years ago, my practice was kind of reviewing value of companies and assets in China in anti-corruption. And I remember once a CFO of a state-owned company that was, to the prior conversation, being sold to a private equity company, described the compliance program and the layers of review, and there'd be an expense, and 10 people would go through the expense and stamp it and approve it, and it was very elaborate, multiple series of labyrinth review. And I asked him, so what would happen if you wanted to buy a Rolex for an official? He looked at me quite simply and said, is it within budget? And that kind of showed that there could be a very elaborate set of systems, and to your point, Eugene's point, paper tigers of compliance programs, that in that case weren't working in practice. And I think our colleagues in antitrust, we have put out a series of questions that we look to evaluate programs. And again, I think it's useful to think of them like the 5 topics. It's one to have policies and procedures. Are there awareness? Whether you look at kind of different data metrics like a net promoter score around kind of compliance or different technologies, or in a whistleblowing context, there's ways to measure psychological safety. There's ways to measure kind of ebbs and flows within whistleblowing reports. And there's ways to measure kind of consequence management, kind of looking at are similar levels of an organization punished the same way, for the same types of behavior, or is compliance kind of a structure of middle management to torture other elements of middle management? And you can kind of ask and get at kind of the root cause of a lot of this. And there's other ways too. Transparency, you can look at, measure how visible different aspects are in an organization. In a small organization, transparency is somewhat intuitive. In large organizations, you need access to crisscrossing sets of ERP systems and other data systems to really drive visibility and create signal of behavior in far-flung, complex organizations. So a lot of it really depends on an organization. But it also comes down to, does compliance have the resources that other people do? Is, marketing and sales, you see very advanced cutting-edge AI and predictive analytics, and is compliance not? And then why is there an asymmetry of kind of resources and technology, particularly where one investment in technology could subsidize another investment in technology? And when you see that kind of differences in values and abilities, you can kind of raise questions is, how effective is compliance in an organization that is so forward here, but compliance is so backward there? How does that work?
So I think one of the things that we've seen over time in the compliance sector is the industry will respond to governmental incentives, and sometimes the response is maybe too extreme. So for a long period of time, because DOJ fraud was so aggressive in enforcing FCPA work, every company has an anti-corruption policy, right? That will be the case because they're worried about an FCPA enforcement action by U.S. authorities, and now worldwide, right? And so I've written a piece where I posited whether or not the FCPA had come to an outsized influence within the firm's assessment of what risk was in front of them, right? That there were firms that had really sophisticated anti-corruption policies where their chief compliance officers were running around giving speeches talking about how strong their anti-corruption policy it was. And they were 2 weeks away from a very serious compliance failure that they had failed to invest in. And so that is one thing that we have to, that I think is important for folks to consider is, am I doing a risk assessment based off of the risks of my particular business and firm? Or am I doing a risk assessment purely in response to governmental incentives? And that might mean you miss something if you are not doing a risk assessment based off of your firm's actual risk profile. The other thing that I've found over time is that many of the biggest scandals, the biggest points of wrongdoing, were formally detected by the firm. So we've spent so much time talking about prevention and detection. I like to unpack the ideas of detection and investigation, because lots of misconduct is formally detected by the firm, and it has failed, and the firm fails to identify it as a red flag. And I mean all the way up to the board. So the board will have knowledge of the misconduct, and they fail to identify how big that misconduct is, and so then they keep going, and they fail to appropriately investigate what they misidentified as something that was not a red flag. And those instances tend to be the most severe for a firm, because they could have stopped it when it was much smaller. And if they'd stopped it when it was much smaller, I don't even know if you would have had a conversation with the government, to be perfectly honest. Like, you just would have investigated it, remediated it, dealt with the misconduct that was occurring and moved on. But instead, because there was a failure to identify it as a red flag, or a failure to appropriately investigate what was going on, then the firm ends up with this big scandal. So one of the things that I proposed is that when firms are doing root cause analysis, instead of asking what was the cause of the compliance failure, to instead ask at what stage or stages did compliance failures occur. So was it a prevention failure, was it an investigation failure, or was it a detection failure, or was it a remediation failure? And by doing that, sometimes when we see see that something's gone wrong, we naturally think, okay, this went wrong, now I need to fix it. And so we find something to fix and then we move on. But for the most sophisticated compliance failures, it's often not one thing that's gone wrong. It's often that there's been a variety of things that have gone wrong throughout the compliance program. And if you aren't thinking expansively, if you are only focusing on one antitrust issue and not the others, then you just end up back before the department, in 6 months or 2 years, when you had an opportunity to do a more robust assessment.
Yeah, anyone else, I think that's an exceptionally important point about risk assessment, and that's obviously one of the factors in the DOJ guidance as well. I mean, we see again and again scenarios where either you have sort of a small company that's sort of grown rapidly over time, the compliance function hasn't sort of evolved with the rest of the company, or you have a large sophisticated company that, say, thinks of itself as sort of private business, but in fact over time it has sort of a government contracting part of their business which sort of evolves over time, and suddenly, even though it's a small percentage of the business, in absolute terms it's actually a really large government contractor, they don't have kind of the government contracting compliance function that you would expect. Or the scenario that you just mentioned, Veronica, which is that people are laser focused on FCPA, their kind of compliance programs are informed by either a bad event they had with the Justice Department, or they're just kind of mirroring what they perceive to be kind of the government's enforcement priorities in the design of their own program. Does anybody else have kind of thoughts on how you do sort of a risk assessment that actually identifies what the risks are to a particular organization?
I don't know if it goes to that specific, how you identify the risk, but I think in terms of the risk assessment, I mean, I've been at the Department of Justice long enough where I have seen a complete shift in how we treat compliance. Whereas previously we didn't give it any credit, we didn't even ask about it. They were before us, and so they obviously had a compliance failure, and so we weren't even really going to engage in that discussion. Well, now we absolutely do engage in that discussion, both in terms of making a charging decision and in terms of, if we do decide to have a resolution of some sort, then what the appropriate disposition or outcome of that is. And that's something we take seriously. And so I think as part of that risk assessment, and I think probably your larger companies have made that mindset shift as well. And so that's why we're seeing more robust compliance programs. But there is a disconnect between, I mean, almost every company that ends up in front of us is advocating that they should get a deferred prosecution agreement or a declination because they have a sufficient compliance program. But we really look behind that and we dig into it and we take seriously that role. So I think part of that risk assessment needs to factor in that is actually going to be part of what we consider, and there is a possibility, if there is a robust, effective compliance program, even if there ended up being a violation, that may result in a non-charge.
Just to stay with my alcohol theme for the day, I have a cousin who recently had his fourth driving under influence DUI, and his assessment was that he should stop drinking a certain brand of vodka after 5 p.m. I think that's an example of a very poorly done risk assessment. I think his problems are far broader. And I see that often with different corporations, that they'll look at an area, and they'll have an overly kind of narrow, myopic sense of risk assessment, that they should just not do this certain type of behavior after 5 p.m., as opposed to looking broadly where else is happening, where things are. I think Veronica was a very good one. When I was a CCO, we covered a huge amount of risk. And I think, risk assessment is not something that you do and never do again. It's something that's continuous, and that you have to kind of think strategically of how to be evergreen. I think nor is it something that a singular kind of part of an organization or kind of authority can do. It's a team sport looking at a broad section of risks in a whole kind of enterprise risk management process within an organization. And so I think that should also be comments, not just with kind of what the organization is doing bad, and then doing a root cause analysis, and kind of looking more broadly at horizon scanning of an organization. I think all of these are factors in. What I think the organizations that I've seen that do this particularly well, also with the risk assessment, do an opportunity assessment. What are the assets that I have that I can use to kind of manage this more effectively? Are we really good at data? Are we really good at branding? Are we really good with communications? And these things can overcome, much in the same way like one muscle group can be stronger and support another, as you're recovering from an injury. You can kind of manage risk in different ways if you're creative about the assets and liabilities of an organization. Now, in my government position, my world narrows. I'm looking at what the fraud section looks at, and I'm looking at kind of more narrow. And so that's a challenge for you, because those that are kind of in my position evaluating the compliance program, evaluated narrowly for the issues that I'm charged with as Department of Justice employee to do. But for you, and I have a lot of empathy for your position, you can't afford to be that narrow. You need to be broad. I think Veronica's point is a good one, but it's challenging because those that judge you will be more narrow than yourself as you look at it.
One aspect of a compliance program that I've seen probably in every deck outlining a compliance program is training. Does training work? And how do we know that if it does? And how do we assess whether training works?
One thing I'll jump in on, just from my own experience in training at the Antitrust Division, we get a lot of training on cybersecurity and phishing, for example, and I think for the most part we listen to it and then we kind of put it behind us. But when they actually started sending us fake phishing emails and saying who clicked on it, and then giving real-time feedback as to those failures, I think that's when it actually started becoming more effective. So training obviously has to be part of any effective program, but there has to be some aspect of getting feedback to people taking that training as to how they're actually doing in regards to, are they implementing it, are they somehow internalizing it?
Gene, I think you've done some work in this area.
And maybe I'll try to link this to the prior question a little bit as well, is that, one obstacle right now is I think a lot of programs see themselves still as I'll say one culture and one organization, so it's not risk-based because they're looking so broadly. But then two, to the extent they start looking, for example, hotline or investigations data, you look by location, and then you go look by division or sector, then you go look at your survey data and you do the same thing, you look by location. And it's not integrated in a cohesive risk-based way. And that's why it's difficult to interpret. And I'll say a lot of our time is spent when I think of behavioral risk is where, let's not just look by location sector, let's go to you think of level 4 and level 5, and actually find the groups of people in an organization are 50 to 100,000 people that are having elevated risk, i.e. you're seeing more allegations actually rise, not at the location, but let's find that location, group, sector, actual process that it's actually rising. Does that also associate where you see the risk arising in the associated survey data? We know, so we've actually done a lot of work where we're connecting actually survey data, confidential survey data, to investigations data, and it absolutely links. What we can see is, I'll say the top 3 questions. If people don't think their manager acts with integrity, they face business pressure to violate policies, and they have low psychological safety, each of those are linked independently with having a 20 to 50% higher chance that that employee will have an investigation against him or her in the coming 6 months. So you imagine, now you're in a group that has low survey data, you're also a group that a manager is engaging this kind of, that group is exceptionally greater risk in the next 6 to 12 months than another group. And that's just taking and subdividing the data. It's not AI or something, it's just being clever about how to break up the data. Now, how does that link to what we were talking about, training? Well, what's the goal of training? Well, if you're in that great group, so let's take all the subcultures. If you're in the fantastic subculture that knows what to do, they're not violating policies, the big scary regulatory ones, or even the little ones. They come into work, they do their work well, they want to thrive and get paid decently for doing so. The training is probably not effective because they already know it, so telling them that same fact is really just taking 30 minutes or 2 hours out of their day. Now, for the group on the other extreme, that's at the low subculture, training may also not be effective because it turns out they're also the people that put it on their second screen. They desperately need to know this information, but they don't pay attention to it. So the question is, well, once we divide up all the subcultures, we know which ones are great. Maybe we can do something much less for them. We can actually simply just test them, assure that they continue to know that knowledge, and so we don't need to train them. And then for the more risky groups, that like vendor-based, very kind of superficial third-party training may not actually be appropriate. Maybe we need to have a real person come in and actually a little bit more invasively start talking to people about this, and that will create. So it's because everything's kind of a one-size-fits-all that we get to see these low average effects. But I would say there are organizations that have actually deployed what I call tailor-made, what I call training or other compliance initiatives that can actually see those shifts in the data in those subgroups. But that requires getting much deeper within an organization, because if you do everything at a level of 50 or 100,000 employees, nothing really shifts in any reasonable time frame. But if you get to those smaller groups, you can actually see effectiveness actually in practice.
And I think there's different ways I used to look at effectiveness of training. When I took over, going back to my CCO role, when I took over that, one of the first things I did was change the training, because I had this like authority given right to reach 100,000 people in an organization. And I could command and force them to spend 45 to an hour and a half of their time on a presentation. And we were giving like the lowest cost, lowest bid kind of PowerPoint that was like dreary and boring. And it was terrible for the compliance brand. And so we redid it. And we thought, okay, how do we do it? And I said, and I talked to the marketing teams. And I said, okay, you guys do like social media and influence campaign for your living. Like, how do I brand like ethics in a way that, you know, like here? And they were, and we looked and said, okay, we can take like metrics of how quickly people you promote. We can take all sorts of kind of atmospheric metrics. Are people talking about the training? And you can look at metrics of a training campaign much in the same way you would look at an advertised campaign, and then kind of get metrics of effectiveness from that. But you could also look at it much bigger. You could say, okay, what am I really trying to train for? Oh, a core aspect of a compliance program, are people aware that you exist? Do they know you have a compliance program? That's a start, right? Which is true of any sort of brand campaign. If they don't know you exist, they can't possibly like you. So like half the battle is just making sure they know you exist. And I had like a great kind of clean slate, because overnight we had a $100 billion acquisition, and suddenly I had, say, 14 different markets in Africa, 9 of which were the largest tax-paying entities in Africa, so big businesses across. And I looked at whistleblowing reporting, and in the prior 5 years, there had been 4 reports, 3 by fax to London, were the total panoply of whistleblowing reports that I inherited. So I had a very easy, clean slate to compare a training program on awareness versus one years later. And after 5 years, it wasn't just training, it was also kind of looking at like modes of communication and creating apps, because the rate of adoption for cell phone apps in Africa was like 10x any other means of getting to employees in Africa. And then we actually could see after 4 years, the spread of whistleblowing reports of compliance policies were the equivalent of companies that we had owned for 20 years. After 4, and I can see an effect, an impact, not just of the training, but training is a component of a broad campaign to solve a goal. So I think the challenge that a lot of organizations face is, what is your goal? What does success look like? And what is the means of training? And how am I going to measure success once I get there? And that would be indicators of an effective compliance program.
So I think one of the things that happens in the compliance space is sometimes firms will invest in compliance activity because they are aware that if they have an offense, they have to then go to the government and show all the things that they did. And that can create an incentives at some firms to be able to say, well, I trained 100,000 employees and I trained them in this and they spent 90 minutes, right? So things that are easy for me to quantify and provide proof to the government that my program was effective. And I think that is distinct from kind of the comments you've heard here, where you have to go beyond just what's going to be the good evidence when I have to go in and negotiate with the government. So I'm not saying that's not important. I understand from a practical perspective that's going to be important for a firm to be able to establish. But what are the things that I can't quantify as easily that are likely to be important for my workforce, right? And so ensuring that that training was actually done in a way where they're going to understand what their obligations are and understand what they're supposed to do if something goes wrong. And I do think think that, I was referencing the Caremark decision before, I kind of think that the origins of the Caremark decision really incentivized you to do the training, not to do these extra steps, to make sure that the training was effective. And so that is one of the, so one of the barriers, I think, or things that have made it harder for compliance to become as sophisticated as it can, is that you can have a legal defense in a civil case, even when the thing hasn't been super effective. The problem with that, though, is that if you're just worried about, for example, the civil case or the fine, you are missing some of the other risks that could be associated, other costs that could be associated with what's going on. So it's not. So I think when we think about training is something you have to have. Like you're not going to walk into the government and say, "Yeah, I didn't do any training." I mean, no one's going to do that. But thinking about it in a really sophisticated, well, I'm seeing some winks, so maybe somebody is. But that I would strongly urge you not to do that in 2023. But the training itself, anyway, so you have to have training, but making sure it's something that people are understanding and that it's accessible and that you're communicating in a way where they're going to put those things in action, I think would be the most ideal situation.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's this scenario in all walks of life that every, college freshman has to make a decision about, are they kind of studying for the test?
Right.
Or are they studying to really have mastery of the material, and you can pass the test without having mastery of the material, but the broader goals of learning are realized when you actually learn the material. You mentioned, Matt, the growth in kind of whistleblower complaints, from Africa after your program. I invite anybody to maybe comment on how do we think about and how do we measure what an effective whistleblowing program is. And is that kind of an important part of a compliance program?
Well, certainly as I'm sitting down and assessing a compliance program, that's going to be one of the key things that we look at. And then in terms of, for my colleagues here on the panel, to maybe some of the specifics, but we're certainly looking to see, is whistleblowing protected, meaning are there anonymous sources? Is there actually, when a complaint comes in, is there action taken at the company to take it seriously and to do something about whatever that complaint is? Is there incentives, meaning are employees actually rewarded in some fashion for detecting and reporting improper conduct, or are they more fearing retaliation and that they're going to get on the bad side of their supervisor? So those are certainly some of the things that I'm looking at when I'm assessing, is whistleblowing effective? And one of the questions as part of our just even asking for documents and materials now, as part of our assessing a case, is we may be asking for, how many complaints did you get and what did you do with them, at least as they relate to the conduct we're looking at.
I guess when I think about it, whistleblowing, I think about the distinction between an internal whistleblower and an external whistleblower. And so we have, it's not just the SEC's whistleblower program. The government has a variety of different programs in place to incentivize external whistleblowing. They all work in a different way. The SEC's, because of the size of the awards the whistleblowers are getting, it gets a lot of attention. But I think when you're thinking about a firm's internal compliance program, your goal is to figure out, how do I get people to alert me to problems internally? One, so I can respond, right? One, so I can investigate and respond. So the whistleblowing is a detection mechanism. It's a really important detection mechanism for firms. It enables, particularly as firms have increased in size and scope, right? So there are some empirical studies that have demonstrated that we have much fewer within the U.S. public companies, but that the size of those companies has increased exponentially. And so when we're thinking about one of the ways that compliance has changed over the last 25 years, the size of firms has changed over the years. So when you're thinking about your compliance program, the distance between, let's say, your senior leadership who's setting the tone and the folks who are in your plants has increased exponentially. And so how are you going to think about getting information from that guy in the plant in Omaha to the CEO in New York, right? Like the distance is just really far. And so part of that is thinking a lot about how do I incentivize folks to provide information internally. One of the things that's been discussed in industry and in literature in the last few years is what sort of management structures are more likely to be able to move that information through the firm. I think the most recent iteration of that suggests to me that folks don't like a decentralized management structure where you house up in different silos that compliance has there's a direct line from compliance in Omaha all the way to New York, that the centralized management structure is better. I actually don't know which one is right. But I do know that you have to, and Eugene will, I'm sure, talk more about this, that you do have to create a space where people believe that if they complain, that complaint won't be ignored, that they won't be harmed, that there won't be retaliation against them for doing that complaint, but that somebody's going to take action on that, which means you have to be responsive when somebody, if it's anonymous, you can't be responsive in theory, that you let them know what happened, that you've followed up on that complaint. So I'll stop there because I know there's other additional things to say.
Others on this? I mean, there's clearly a lot done around preventing retaliation, preventing harm to a whistleblower. I mean, one question is sort of affirmatively incentivizing people to do something. There's a difference between kind of making sure that if somebody isn't penalized for being a whistleblower and encouraging kind of a more proactive step.
I think there's a lot of different dimensions to this. First is the awareness of an apparatus to report something, awareness that you can do that, and that's something that you can measure to say, okay, what is the kind of right number of per capita reports, and you can kind of compare across either a lot of platforms will allow you to kind of share that information kind of roughly, and you kind of see where you are. Or if you're in a big organization, you can kind of see what a normal per capita number of reports for a type of behavior, along the lines of what Eugene was just talking about in terms of a spread. And then there's kind of backstage, what happens to it, how fast, what's the velocity of reports, how people are dealing with them, and then what are the outcomes? The outcomes consistent across the organization. And these are things in kind of advantage in government you kind of generally see and get metrics for. But there's others, right? And there's kind of unintended consequences of operating a program that get very complicated. And I remember, for example, talking with a number of chief compliance officers for a particular region, and all of us had a strange, very kind of nuanced problem on reporting. And it was in an area of a high amount of violence, and there were a lot of bodies that would be left in factories as byproducts of violence. But no one wanted to report them, because if you reported them, then the police would come or compliance would come and they would shut down operations for a certain amount of time. And it was a very difficult, challenging problem because people just they would just throw the bodies somewhere else. And there was a huge incentive because the compliance, either whether it was police or internal compliance operating procedures, were so disruptive to the business that there was a very strong countervailing disincentive to report because the process was so cumbersome to get to the bottom to investigate. And so it's very nuanced to think about. In my government seat, it's not a level of detail you would ever get to. But in an in-house seat, how do you set up a process that can incentivize behavior that the process itself does not deter the behavior you want, and you get the worst possible outcome? And there's a lot of examples I can think like that where the process can deter the behavior you want, because you get kind of caught up in thinking of the outcomes rather than the costs of implementing the process.
Go ahead, James.
Maybe just to add to this discussion, I'll say, every time we start working with a company, I'll say I ask the question of, what is the goal of your hotline and investigations process? And I'll say I'm struck by the two most common answers to that question when you actually ask the person that's leading that. The first is that kind of we have to do it, so it's mandated. And the second is, I don't know, or I need to get back to you. I will say, I don't know which is the worst answer, but neither of those is a goal or a KPI. They would fail at any business school classroom. I don't know, it's really bad, but saying because you have to, that's not a goal, that's just telling what it is. I mean, I think if we all sit down here and spend just a minute thinking, I think we quickly come to the goal of the helpline and the associated investigative process is to try to, with maximum efficiency, get to the effective resolution. Substantiate things that ought to be substantiated in the minimum possible time, because both of it's management of resources for the company and to not create any more burden for employees that it's a stressful process that are involved. I would say if you quickly think of that as the goal of your helpline and investigative process, you would design oftentimes a very different looking hotline, and this is a lot of time where we're spending time. You think about the questions differently, how you frame it, what you seek to try to do with that information. And I think for a lot of areas, and this gets to where we started this conversation around effectiveness, it's because organizations have thought of we have to do it, so we just implement it, but they haven't thought of it with the goal, which is what's being described here in a lot of the questions. And I wrote a case study, I would say, on ABI, a math program. Like I can see what math did at ABI was thinking through each part of the program with like a KPI or a goal of intent. It's taking a business-based lens and applying it to design the compliance program. But that's still, I will say, rare. And I think the advantage of both the antitrust and the criminal division's evaluation of compliance programs is it's actually forcing companies to start thinking about a KPI. I will say it's a little bit like molasses, though. It's still pretty slow because I think it's just a different and oftentimes very uncomfortable way, because it actually forces you to kind of think about the very foundations of even things like your helpline in terms of how you want to design it.
And it's incredibly challenging because you can look at the data, but that won't always tell you the full story. Just to state an example, I talked about kind of the experience of rolling out a helpline across Africa. And the very first compliance report with our newly minted, fresh compliance officer was in South Africa. And it was a black mamba that was loose in a factory. And so he's like, I am not qualified to deal with that. But often the reports are not really indicative of what really the issue is, because they had caught the black mamba. And the issue wasn't the original black mamba. The issue was that apparently black mambas go in pairs. And so the workforce assumed that there was a second, the highly poisonous snake on premises. And management did not think that that belief was strong enough to stop work and find the fictional mamba. And so it was actually a workplace dispute of risk tolerance between management, which thought they should kind of continue operations, and the workforce, who would be the ones that would get bit by a snake. And so the issue was actually far more nuanced in kind of labor than merely catching a snake. And that doesn't always jump out, from the data or the operations.
Well, I think we are at time, so unless there are any other closing comments, I will thank the panelists and everybody for their attention, and I think we have a lunch break at this point.